This is episode number 100B, and it's a bonus episode as a part of celebrating our 100th episode. This was one of Lisa Victoria's favorite episodes, which we didn't include in episode 100, so we brought it to you here. And it's with Elaine Wilkins. It's titled Lisa Victoria's second favorite, Elaine Wilkins on fatigue, stress, and exhaustion. And they're talking about dissolving the mysteries of chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. And as a reminder, you can come to this episode, or episode 100, and also take a look at the top 8 all-time downloaded episodes on Alternative Health Tools podcast. And a simple reminder to join us for a live Zoom call with the practitioners. The community call is Saturday, August 22nd, 2020 at 9:30 a.m. Pacific in the U.S., 12:30 Eastern, and 5:30 p.m. in the U.K. And if you come to alternativehealthtools.com, on that page, you'll see a click here to register for the call. And I've included the quotes Lisa pulled out of Elaine's episode she wanted you to know. A lot of people are fatigued, burnt out from work. I thought my body let me down, but I realized I let my body down. About satellite navigation. Our body gives us messages. We can sometimes disconnect from our bodies by living on our heads and miss the messages. We often ignore and override messages. About disease. Our bodies get stressed and then something comes along. Start to think about lifestyle and pace. Start to recognize early warning signs. Mitigate with learning and create a live, vibrant life. Most people are vertically ill. We don't know what optimum health is. We can't ever remember feeling well, living under par 21st century syndrome. Thrive and become everything you were meant to be. And we now bring you Lisa's conversation with Elaine Wilkins. And so we're back, and Lisa, you had another episode that you just really enjoyed. It's fairly recent, right?
Yeah, I just, before we move on to that episode, I just wanted to pick something else out of Alan Cohen's 86, Being Your Authentic Self. And for me, this was a comment that kind of struck me very much so. It was, for every minus is half a plus, waiting for a stroke of vertical awareness. And I love that. It's how I interpreted it is there's no good times or no negative times or no minuses. We're just waiting for that, stroke of genius to turn it into a positive. And one of the reasons why I love that quote so much is I just think for anybody out there who's struggling right now, it's, with everything that's been going on, out of a bad time can come good times. It's just we need to look for them. So don't give up hope is my message to people.
So they are there. You just have to be open and aware to them, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. God, that is so beautifully said. Now, what is his quote again? Say it again slowly.
For every minus is half a plus, waiting for a stroke of vertical awareness.
Nice.
So the next episode was 98, and that was on fatigue, stress, and exhaustion with Elaine Wilkins. And the reason why this is one of my favourites is it's quite personal to me and my journey. Mm-hmm. And, fatigue can show up in many people in different ways. And it's not just about, people who have chronic exhaustion. Most people are mildly exhausted and just don't realise, but it's become their new norm. So one of the things that I love to do is show people that there is a way to have more energy and less stress. And that's one of the reasons why I love that episode so much. One of the things that she said is most people are kind of disconnected from their bodies and they're not listening to the messages. And I can certainly look back on my journey and think there were warning signs. I just wasn't listening to my body. And because I wasn't listening, along came, a great big rock from the universe that kind of said, right, if you're not listening now, then we'll make you stop and listen.
Mm.
Welcome to the Alternative Health Tools podcast. I'm Lisa Victoria, your host, and today we are talking about dissolving the mystery of chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia recovery. and I am joined with our wonderful guest, Elaine Wilkins. Welcome, Elaine.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Lisa.
And before we get going, just a little bit about you, Elaine. You're an accredited wellbeing coach, the CEO of the Chrysalis Effect, ME chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia recovery specialist, and also a leader in digital healthcare. You've been a very busy lady. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about your journey and how you've got to do what you do now?
Yeah, certainly. So it was really necessity being the mother of invention with the Chrysalis Effect, because my own background was that I developed a fatigue illness back in 2000 after returning from a long haul flight. I was really sort of working in international capacity training and doing lots of traveling and things. And I came home from this particular flight and felt very unwell and put it down to jet lag and thought, oh, I'll be okay in a few days. And actually that jet lag went on, and it was really quite scary. And that was the sort of starting point for a 6-year journey of chronic fatigue that left me with periods of being bedbound and in a very difficult place, because normally when things go wrong, you tend to go and have some blood tests done, and then hopefully there's some sort of diagnosis and treatment plan. But what happened for me was that it was 18 months until I got a formal diagnosis, and physically every aspect of my body felt like it was shutting down. I had a lot of cognitive issues, so I had a lot of brain fog. I couldn't concentrate. I had a lot of gut issues and IBS, that type of thing. But the major thing was this just unrelenting exhaustion, and I couldn't sleep. So I also was awake all night feeling exhausted, but my brain was running a marathon because I was trying to figure out what had happened and how to get well. So that 6 years was really trial and error. And I realized about 18 months in, once I had that diagnosis, it was probably the most scary thing, because for a moment I felt relieved that I had some formal diagnosis. And then, of course, there was nothing. There was no treatment plan. There was no, explaining to me what had happened and what to do about it. So I was pretty much sent home, and like many people, started to do my research. It was very scary. I started to look online and found all these descriptions of long-term chronic illness, having to accept that was going to be my future. And so I looked for sort of other things. I looked for support groups, and in those at that time it was much more face-to-face support groups, and went along to a couple of groups and found that I was hoping for some nuggets of what to do to get well, and it didn't seem like that at all. It seemed like everybody was really discussing how ill they felt, and it was discussions about claiming benefits and living with a long-term condition. And then ultimately, a little chink of light, I was sent to a course called an expert patients course, and I went along with hope in my heart, hoping that somebody had some answers. In the meantime, I was reading and trying to do things through the brain fog and all the cognitive issues and insomnia and all the problems I had. And when I went into that room, I was so shocked, because I had been put in a room with about 20 other people who had chronic illnesses, and people that had car accidents, that had life-changing injuries. So the message was very loud and clear that this was a long-term chronic illness. That's what the medical profession was telling me, and that I had to learn ways to manage my symptoms and manage my illness. And I was early 40s with 2 young teenagers. There was absolutely no way that I could accept that. So it was really a 6-year journey of trying to figure it out myself, and spending money I didn't have on treatments that didn't work and going everywhere to try and get answers. So that was back in 2000. So it took me 6 years of being highly motivated, trying to work through with all the difficulties that brought and the financial collapse that it brought to us. I lost my business. My son had to move schools. We had to downsize because I'd been a major breadwinner. So I really do know what this can bring to someone's life and the devastation that you feel. And in the early days, I was so frustrated. All I wanted to do was get back to my life as I'd known it. But of course, the learning in that 6 years was that my life actually wasn't working. And I'd been ill for a lot longer than I'd realised. And all that had happened was that my body had reached a tipping point. So that was really, I'd love to say to you that when I finally got well, that I rushed out to help everybody, but I was so terrified of it coming back, and I wanted nothing to do with chronic fatigue. I was just so grateful to feel fully recovered, and I'd done a lot of internal work and changed my nutrition. I'd done so many things, and then I went into coaching and loved what I was doing, but the universe had other plans, Lisa, because what happened was I ended up doing some corporate coaching and training and teaching and mentoring people in coaching. And pretty much every single person I sat in front of started talking about their fatigue. And so it was a bit like, so it was good because it felt like there was some input I could give people. But again, it hadn't ever dawned on me to specialize or do anything with this. And then there was something major that happened in the UK on the BBC. This story broke of this young woman of 34. There was these photographs of her beautiful child who danced and had all her exam medals and things. She'd been a high achiever, which, we'll probably talk a bit about today because it's very much part of the profile of people that tend to succumb to chronic fatigue. And she committed suicide. She was 34. And it was because she had been ill for 17 years with, her diagnosis was ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis. And her poor mother, who'd nursed her and helped her and had been, as a loss as I was of what to do, she had been arrested for aiding and abetting the suicide of her daughter. So it was just this massive case.
Really
tragic. And what I did, I obviously was just horrified, really. And so I started reading around it. And what I discovered was that when I looked back at the bit of the background story, this young woman, really, her trajectory into her illness hadn't been too different to mine. And it was very clear that the things I'd learned through my recovery, those themes had been there. And yet this terrible, tragic outcome. And so at that point, it was funny, I was meeting a friend for coffee that day, and she'd also had a fatigue journey. And she said to me, "Have you seen the news?" And I said, "Yes, we've got to do something. We absolutely can't not share with people, that recovery is possible." And so basically that was it. We started with, we got a few leaflets printed, and went and saw a venue and was going to book a workshop called Get Your Life Back. And I think I put £150 in and she put £150 in, and we had this really awful website built by someone that we knew. And within a very short space of time, we had over 1,000 emails saying, "Can't get to the workshop. I'm so ill. Please help me. Have you got a book? Have you got something?" And so that was the beginning of the chrysalis effect. We realized that workshops was not going to be the way to go to help anyone. And I don't know, it was just a catalyst really for realizing that, I suppose being a coach, life purpose is so hugely important. And it seemed like I was being drawn to do something. And when I started researching, I realized there's over 17 million people worldwide diagnosed, and the approach out there is to manage a long-term chronic illness, and people aren't given recovery information. So that was really where it all began.
Wow, thank you for sharing. What a phenomenal story and a journey, and there's lots of things I want to pick up on in there. And you know, that you talk about jet lag and that brain fog, and, you know, we've all had it. I mean, I've had chronic fatigue syndrome myself, as we've discussed before, and I was 22 when I was diagnosed, and similar to you, you know, I was sent home with antidepressants and told I'd end up in a wheelchair. So it was like, there's no future for you. That's it. You've just got to manage your condition, and it's going to get progressively worse. But everybody out there's, you know, suffered from jet lag. Everybody suffers from chronic fatigue. So whilst we say there's 17 million diagnosed sufferers, there's a lot more people out there with fatigue. So this podcast is for anybody and everybody really who has felt or feels sometimes that fatigue, or knows anyone who is struggling with fatigue. And that could just be from burnout from work, couldn't it?
Exactly, yeah. And, you know, there's something that when we look at this, you know, your body is, I remember thinking that my body had let me down. And actually what I learned through my recovery journey was that I'd let my body down, because our body is this incredible satellite navigation that tries to give us messages. And I think in today's world, this 21st century world, it's so easy for us to become disconnected from our body. You know, we're living up here in our heads. And therefore, I wasn't listening to any of the messages throughout my life. You know, the old model is that you live your life and you feel unwell and you go to the doctors and ask for something, don't you? And I suppose I'd been brought up in that sort of culture, really.
We're taught to treat the symptom rather than
and then the symptoms are treated, and nobody at any point really looks at what's going on around that. So I think that's the big problem, and so we learn to override and ignore these messages. You know, the adverts on the TV show people taking a tablet and back at work the next day, you know, and so therefore we get very good at ignoring those signals. But, you know, really all chronic fatigue, ME, fibromyalgia it's just a set of, it's a label given to a set of symptoms where our body is feeling very uneasy. There's a lot of dis-ease, and it will start giving us early messages. And the more we ignore that, at some point, the body and the system is going to become so stressed, so much inflammation, that something's going to come along, like it did with me, and tip us over. And if it doesn't develop into chronic fatigue, then it's going to develop into something, isn't it? If your body's not feeling good. So we work with some sort of bit of a continuum, really, and it is absolutely true that it's relevant to everyone. So, you know, we all experience normal tiredness. Then sometimes people will say, you know, just feel tired all the time, and then it can again the body sort of takes it up a notch, and it will feel like exhaustion. And that's often where people are getting through their workload, doing what they can to keep going, and then perhaps, like certainly with me, I was putting on a good show during the day and pushing through, and then weekends I was absolutely wiped out. So sort of sleeping and just hoping that I was going to feel better the next day. And I did that for a long time, lots of little mini crashes and lots of fatigue issues throughout my life, really. But then exhaustion can turn into that burnout, and we sort of know the sorts of things that we experience with burnout. You know, the sort of symptoms tend to be gut issues and headaches, and all those early warning signs, really.
But yeah, and it's exactly as you say, isn't it? Is fatigue and burnout, and fatigue could mean different things to different people, couldn't it?
Yeah.
For one person who's a runner, they might say, "Well, I'm feeling a bit fatigued today. I could only run 10 miles rather than 15." So what's going on? Your body is giving you feedback.
Yes.
And then on the other end of the scale, there's people who maybe can't even get out of bed in the morning. They can't function, but the body is always giving you feedback. And I loved what you said earlier. You said, it's about we've become disconnected from our bodies.
Oh, completely.
Because we're so busy in the modern day life that we're in our heads rushing around at 90 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And, we're in the midst of, the coronavirus crisis now, and it's all more ever important that people are having to slow down and take that step back. So what a great opportunity for us to reconnect with our bodies and start listening to our bodies and understanding what it's actually telling us.
Yeah, because now I live my life very differently. The chrysalis effect is it is an online. We developed the recovery pathway so that we can make recovery accessible to all, and that is a recovery pathway now that we've been working for. We're in our 11th year, so we've been working to make sure that instead of people going to their GPs and being given this sort of left in limbo, and blood tests, or they always come back, the blood tests usually come back clear, all the tests, then there's all these referrals to different people going around the houses, and then feeling disbelieved because nothing seems to be concrete about it. So the problem is, and the reason that these illnesses take hold, is because people don't understand what's happened, they don't understand what to do about it, they don't get recovery information early enough. So the work over 11 years has been about making headway into, certainly in the UK, we've got the NHS system there, making sure that recovery information, that there's a recovery pathway available at point of GP referral, and we've just made that happen. That's just where we're at now, which is fantastic. It means that the health service are much more open. Then they know that the symptom-based model, the old model, isn't working, looking for that that holistic approach going forward. So that was sort of the driving factor, really, so that people can, so that all those symptoms, those odd headaches, or the bloating, or the not being able to sleep, or the bouts of tiredness, all those things, instead of being treated as individual things, are put together as a whole picture, because we're just off track somewhere, and it's been, chronic fatigue has been described as sort of an identity in crisis. And what we see is, as much as it's horrible when you're going through it and you're trying to get back to what you think is normal life, it's seen as it really is a gift. It's like your body just says enough.
Yeah.
There is something not working, be it, your relationships might need looking at, you're possibly doing a job that doesn't fit with who you are. There's an awful lot maybe of saying yes when you really want to say no. So your lifestyle and pace has got out of whack. We've got 8 key areas that, from all the research of all the people that have fully recovered, so not looking at the disease process, but looking at who's fully recovered from this and is vibrant and healthy and well. And these 8 key areas, without exception, have to be addressed. And I think for people trying to do this piecemeal, that's what I wanted to take away, so that we could systematically, A, know that recovery is possible, B, start to get underneath those symptoms and look at what's really going on and the drivers. And the journey of the chrysalis effect has been incredible, learning from people's journeys, but also finding the science that underpins what we saw happening over and over again, and the underlying themes and facts, and the predispositions of people that tend to end up feeling increasing levels of fatigue and ending up in a compromise, where their health is severely compromised if they don't get an intervention at the right time. For me, these things can be prevented. It's just all about recognizing things early enough and putting those, intercepting the whole process, really.
It's proactive self-care, isn't it, rather than reactive?
Massively.
And
yeah,
what you've said there is, a lot of people out there might be thinking, well, I've been told to, just pull my socks up and cheer up. We're told to just get on with it. It's going to be okay. And exactly what you've just said there is, you can't fix one thing without fixing the other. So you can't just, work on the mindset if your gut health's poor. And if you've got a bad relationship, or a toxic relationship, or a career that doesn't fit with you and is burning you out, there's so many different factors and elements, and you've got to look at it holistically, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that people find so helpful, I think, is when we start to share the sort of profile and the predisposition. Because what intrigued me was that I was one of 4 siblings, and we all ended up running our own businesses, interestingly. But I was the one that tipped over into chronic fatigue. And so what was different about me? Why did I tip over into chronic fatigue syndrome? They all got their own things, but there was something that around that I wanted to find out more about. And so that's been the fascinating part for me, is and the privilege of being able to share that kind of information with people. So looking at the predispositions, understanding where those the behaviours, because I think it wasn't until I trained in coaching years after I recovered that I actually saw I understood where that driven type of behaviour came from, where I'd really pushed myself so hard and tipped over. So I think what I was excited about was, and also things like thyroid and adrenals are hugely important. And it was 5.5 years into my recovery before and I had a massive relapse, and I was devastated because I thought I was almost there. And of course, it was the missing piece of my puzzle. Everybody does it at different times, but I just couldn't believe that I'd slipped back down to such a low place. And then working with a naturopath who looked me in the eye and said, you can recover, and explained the missing piece to me that I hadn't understood about the dysregulation of the adrenals and how that affects the thyroid. So I thought, oh my God, if I'd have had that information 5 years ago, so my excitement around this is that we can give people this understanding and learning, and and actually help them to recognize how potentially they could have been 6 times more likely to be heading for a fatigue or a fibromyalgia diagnosis than other people, and understanding the reasons behind that and mitigating that with learning how to create a life where you can be vibrant and healthy and balanced. And that's my biggest joy, really, is it's not just about recovery, it's about going forward and probably being healthier than you've ever been.
And who doesn't want to be vibrant and healthy and balanced?
Exactly, because you've only got to see with the COVID thing, my husband even said this to me the other day, is that the reason that people are sort of reacting potentially so badly, what do we keep hearing? Underlying health conditions. When we look at us globally, how many people I think Patrick Holford, the famous nutritional therapist, I interviewed him for the recovery pathway, and he said that most people are vertically ill. They're walking around, and I think we get used to, or can get used to, operating so far below par. We don't know what optimum well-being is. When we have health profiles come into the Chrysalis Effect, and we ask, how long people have been having symptoms and what's going on, and the amount of times people say, I can't actually remember ever feeling well, really well. They don't know what wellness is. So, we, as a society, I think that sadly, we've got used to just living at half, under par all the time with this 21st, well, it's been called 21st century syndrome. And I think maybe the COVID, as tragic as it is for many, it's given us a chance to reset. And so many people that are coming through the recovery pathway with us have said, you know what, I've been doing this for some time, enjoying solitude, practicing self-care, really not getting the level of overwhelm and taking on too much and spinning all the plates like they used to. And so it wasn't such a big adjustment for them because they're actually prioritizing all the things that people perhaps have struggled with, that have come out of that crazy, the crazy busy lifestyle that people lead. So yeah.
And the first thing, like you say, is recognition, isn't it? Because if we don't recognize it, then we can't change it.
No,
and
exactly.
Just knowing what is normal energy levels. And a lot of people settle for less. And quite often when I'm coaching clients, and I coach with a mindset as well, I'll say to them, well, when was the last time you felt excited? Or when was the last time you felt happy? And they think and they say, I can't actually remember, but they can tell me when the last time they felt anxious or stressed
Yeah,
or depressed. And that's really sad, isn't it? Because that's become their new norm, what they've practiced. And it's exactly the same with physical
yeah,
health, is we settle for less than we deserve.
yeah,
And that's,
exactly.
what we're talking about today, isn't it? It's how to live a more fulfilled, thriving life. And I think
Yeah,
we should delve a little bit more into the detail. What do you think?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
So we talked off show about the link between the orchid and the dandelion children. Should we delve a little bit deeper into that? Because I'm curious to know more.
yeah, absolutely. So I think what I'd like to sort of look at was where we sort of started with that, really. So a lot of the symptoms that people start to notice when their life's sort of getting off track is they start to feel drained and sort of exhausted. There's sleep issues. Sometimes it's things like palpitations, gut issues and things, and anxiety comes up a lot. Sort of sometimes their immune system starts to get affected, so might find that there's a few more colds happening more often, more regularly. Appetite's affected, either increased or lost or whatever, and headaches, unexplained pain, all of those sorts of things. But one of the major things that we see is this increase of they call it lack of resilience, I suppose. What you used to be able to cope with, you can't really cope with in the same way, and feeling more anxious about doing sort of normal things. So they tend to be sort of very common things that people start to talk about. So in terms of the orchid and the dandelion, what we have now is we have an understanding of the science of genetic sensitivity. And there is actually a stress vulnerability gene that's been identified. So it's Duke University. The researchers identified a specific gene variant that's linked to what they term orchid children, who are highly sensitive to their environments and particularly vulnerable to stress. So if we think about this, if we think about an orchid and a dandelion, so let's think about, and it took me back to when I was thinking about my own siblings. So, with dandelions, they're sort of, they'll grow anywhere, won't they? They thrive. You can go on a building site where everything's been knocked down, and there will be these little bright sunny flowers will pop up through the concrete, and they just seem
extremely resilient, aren't they?
Yeah, they're completely resilient. And then if we think about orchids, well, I don't know if you've ever tried to grow an orchid, Lisa, but I have, and
yes.
they're not easy. They are very sensitive to their environment, and they can't thrive unless they're in absolutely optimum sort of conditions. And they're beautiful when they are in the right environment, but people often don't know how to treat them. And what we see is that this actually is exactly what we see with children. So one of the things we look at in the profile of somebody who develops, fatigue or fibromyalgia, is that they usually identify it with the fact that they were very sensitive as children. May not have recognized it, but looking back, they can see that. So what I sort of mean by that is that maybe they would be sensitive to certain foods, and and maybe have started having some sort of tummy troubles as a youngster. Maybe felt things very deeply. So when something happened in the family, or even watching TV, they get very, very upset. Often the children, where you take them to a party, or if there's a lot of noise, they might find it quite sort of overwhelming, that type of thing. But also often feeling that they can sense that things when they're not comfortable. Sometimes if you see children being introduced to other adults and they don't react in the way the parent wants them to, that they might be sort of holding back or whatever, with orchid children, they're intensely sensitive, physically, emotionally, and environmentally.
Mm-hmm.
And
I was
so,
definitely an orchid when I was a
yeah,
child.
so what we see is that, but the difficulty with orchid children, and we'll look a little bit about where that comes from, but the difficulty is that often it's the family around them that make comments about that sensitivity. So often these children will be, teased. I know, going back to my own childhood, I was one of four, and I found it very deeply distressing to be criticised or teased, and so they'd say, "Oh, there's something wrong with you. You can't take a joke," and things like that. So, if that's the case, if someone is highly sensitive to their environment and they react to things and they speak out about it, if they're criticised or teased or bullied about it or whatever, what can happen is some cover-up behaviour starts to happen. They get a message that I'm not okay. And so this is the early days of where they sort of tend to feel they've got to put on a bit of a mask. And so what happens there is that they end up, because what we recognise is that they're highly empathic, highly sensitive, and they feel what others are feeling. Yeah. So what that leads to is this kind of putting on this act, this brave face. And so what we see is almost a double bind being created in adulthood. So from a child, what they'll do is they'll attempt to sort of control their environment. So often they'll find ways to please others and become sort of people pleasers. And they'll develop this tendency to try and fix things. Certainly if there's things going on in the home or the family that isn't harmonious, they have this need to want things to be right. Mm-hmm. So we find that these children will often be in a position where they'll take on responsibility too young. So that could be caring for siblings, or if the parents are going through problems and overshare that information, or they'll just sense that there's things going on, then the children start to step up and be adult too young. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you can relate to that, but
I completely relate to being an orchid. Yeah. I had a lovely family home, but the sensitivity of, if someone said something to me, my mum would say, Lisa's sat in the corner crying. Why are you sat in the corner crying? I've only told you to move away from the fire so you don't get burnt. And she'd be saying, you were such a sensitive, quiet little girl who, just used to hide away. Yeah. So I can completely relate to that. And as I'm hearing you talk, I'm just thinking about parents out there who perhaps listening to this and they haven't got fatigue, but they might recognize some of these signs in their children. Are we going to talk about what they can do and top tips, or how we can give them some signposts and direction for support?
Exactly. So the first thing I would say is order Elaine Aron's book, The Highly Sensitive Child. Okay. And there's also The Highly Sensitive Person. There's a little checklist in there on page 1. And what you often find is highly sensitive adults produce highly sensitive children. But the wonderful thing is, once you actually understand what's going on, and the positive side of being highly sensitive is that often very creative, highly empathic, sense things, and so when you harness that in the right way, then that person can just be phenomenal. It's when they are somehow made to feel bad about that sensitivity, and what we often see that turning into is a needing to prove oneself or gain approval. So in the sort of fatigue profile, what we see is in adulthood, an A-type personality where someone feels they have to overachieve, go the extra mile, become perfectionist, and often if it's not in work or sport, that overachieving, then it'll be an overgiving. So not prioritizing their own needs. So sensitive children learn not that they won't necessarily get their needs met, so they will often become the overgivers in society. And the drivenness comes out of a not feeling quite right, to feeling flawed in some way. And nobody sets out to do that to a child, but having an understanding around that, that sensitivity is just a life changer. I've got sensitive children, I've got sensitive grandchildren, and so we have like an orchid farm. We know what each other needs, which is so, what a gift. I went through all of that because I was totally misunderstood. There's a lot that goes into it. Often it comes from the environment that you've grown up in, and I will go through a couple of bits on that, because I think people may resonate with some of the things that have led to the genetics of sensitivity, because we've got these genes that can be potentially switched on in different environments. We may have heard of Bruce Lipton's epigenetics.
Genetics, yeah.
So what we see is that if someone is, got the predisposition, got these genes, is a sensitive person, in the right environment, it's absolutely fine. In the wrong environment, where a dandelion would thrive, an orchid will not thrive, and they will internalize an awful lot. And that at some point, that emotional pain of not getting your needs met, and will manifest later on. So the other sort of aspects, just to go through the profile, and then I'll go through a little bit about the actual adverse childhood experiences and the ACE scoring, because I think people can do that very quickly and piece that together.
And I think just picking up on something you said there about your family is an orchid family, once you can nurture that sensitivity,
absolutely,
can't you? And that's the beauty of knowing this, isn't it? Is knowing how to create that right environment for
it is, because then people can thrive and become everything they were meant to be, without going through so much pain and things. So this A-type personality, perfectionist, and that high expectation of self that often comes out of taking on the feeling that you need to take on responsibility or try and fix things from a young age, that can lead in the workplace or in running businesses to be always having multiple projects on the go, being all things to all people, hate letting people down, and there's a big fear that develops of what others think of us. So there's that fear that people will think we're lazy or incapable, and there's also this feeling that people often will report of being like a fish out of water, feeling that you don't really kind of fit with your family or with others around you. And that's because often of that, that feeling that people don't get you. And that can often come from what we call misattunement. And that can be not even your primary caregiver, that attachment from when you're first born is often with a mother. Well, if that mother has had a traumatic birth, if they suffer with postnatal depression, if they have been very stressed through the pregnancy, all of those things will actually impact the way that that bonding happens. And so what we have, and this is the really interesting bit, is that if we have this predisposition to be highly sensitive, what also can happen is that it means that we're wired to potentially become very hypervigilant. And so the environment that we grow up in, the things that are going on around us, will add to the impact of our of how our nervous system develops. So when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, they come under sort of three types. So there's abuse, which is physical, emotional, and sexual. And that does not need to be, that emotional abuse can just be what I've been talking about, name calling. For a sensitive child, they can't cope with it. So, we talk about this in terms of trauma, not trauma like a car accident, but small t trauma. When someone does not feel that they're emotionally supported in what's right for them, then that sets up all kinds of fears. Really, it really does. it triggers that hypervigilant state, the fight or flight response in our bodies. And so as the developing brain in children, what happens is that children that are in difficult environments for them, are all kids, they lose the ability to contextualize fear. So they can feel that they're in a position of chronic, unpredictable stress, and that's the worst environment for a potentially sensitive child. So we've got the abuse there, we've got neglect. Now, again, that's physical or emotional. So emotional neglect could just be being ignored, not being given the support that child needs to thrive. And then the third category is household dysfunction. So this is the one we see most commonly, to be honest. And this is where the relationship between the parents is often dysfunctional. Now, an all-kid child will feel every bit of that, even if, parents often say, we don't round in front of the children. You don't need to. No. They can feel every single thing that's going on. They can in an energetic way. So the household dysfunction is living with somebody with perhaps anxiety, depression, some sort of mental illness. It can be observing, shouting and arguing, and maybe a parent being treated violently, or a sibling indeed being treated violently. I can remember my sister being caught smoking when she was a teenager, and my dad made us sit and watch her. He made her have a roll-up cigarette, which and smoke it in front of everyone. I can just remember she was my favourite sister. It actually brings up tears now. And watching her being humiliated and so upset was horrendous to me. That was my dad just thinking he'd teach us all a lesson. But the irony was he smoked. So for me, I knew that was just so wrong. And yet, as children aren't resilient. They just don't have the power to change things. No. So it all becomes internalized. And of course, the other household dysfunction is when parents split. And so, or if they're witness to any sort of substance abuse, or if someone dies and it's not talked about, that is horrific for a child, because a lot of people talk about things, and they're doing it at the moment with COVID. They're having the radio and the TV on all the time. And these children's brains are taking all this fear in, and they're not being protected. Yeah. And Bernie,
we don't have any protection on our lives. Nobody teaches us how to manage our emotions at school. We get taught the maths and the English, but we don't get taught how to manage emotions. And exactly like you're saying, if you're in an environment where you're a highly sensitive child, then how do you manage those emotions? What tools have you got to manage those emotions? You haven't as a child. You look to your parents for guidance. We learn from observation, and actually, like you say, it then goes into our subconscious, doesn't it, and into our bodies, and then manifests itself for later in life.
Well, you're literally, your biography becomes your biology. Yes. And so if children are exposed to what feels like sort of unpredictable chronic stress, then it landscapes the brain. And so those neurons that fire together wire together. So this is where we start to see the predisposition developing, because the unconscious feels like it's permanently under threat. Yes. And children then can't develop self-trust. And this is the key. They can't develop an internal sense of safety. And so that drivenness that I've talked about, that is an attempt to keep busy, because the other side effect is that they can't regulate very easily. They haven't learned to regulate their emotions very easily. So what they do is they learn to negate them and suppress them. Yes. So therefore, they're not processing the things that are upsetting them, and it all literally gets pushed down and pushed down. And so a huge part of recovery is about working through, the nutrition, and the lifestyle changes and some external things, but actually it is about processing the unprocessed traumas and griefs that have happened to us that have been stored up. And Dr. Bernie Siegel, he's a retired oncologist and paediatric surgeon and author, fabulous man. Interviewed him, real New Yorker, is lovely. And he says our childhood is stored up in our bodies and one day it will present its bill. And Dr. Felitti, who discovered the ACE scoring, put it all together, all the research behind that, fascinating read for those of your listeners that would like to check that out. He stumbled across the importance of ACE, adverse childhood experiences, which is now kind of called the theory of everything. When he was running
what's the book, sorry, there for our
that was Dr. Felitti, and he if you look him up online, you'll see the he developed the ACE quiz so that people can go on and look and measure their adverse childhood experience score, because his research shows that the higher the ACE score, the higher they've actually got the links to the development of illness in later life, chronic illness like heart disease, strokes, cancer. And what we've done from that, the work that's been developed from that and the ACE awareness campaigns, what we see is the links to childhood illnesses. So the early warnings are sort of asthma and all the sort of the childhood ailments, but because they're not picked up and looked at within, what's going on in that child's life, then what he says is what happens to children plays out powerfully decades later. So when we work with people with chronic fatigue, what we start to look at is there will have been a denial phase. There will have been probably several years of pushing through, making yourself do things that weren't right for you, leading that busy, crazy life. And then you're physically stopped through some sort of tipping point, a virus or whatever is on this highly stressed system. And
what we find, interesting you talk about a tipping point, because I put a post on social media this morning about cycling, because for me with the chronic fatigue syndrome, I developed this massive fear of exercise, because whenever I tried to exercise, I then was burnt out for days on end. And I did a 20-mile bike ride the other day, and even when I was on the cycle ride, the negative voice was kicking in saying, what happens if you won't get around? You might get fatigued on the way. And, those neurological pathways had been created, but I had to find a way to manage them while I was out cycling. And I talked in my post this morning about that tipping point, because for me, I had that tipping point at the age of 22, whereas different people, hopefully, we would like to think some people never hit that tipping point, but it does hit people at different times in their life. And if it doesn't, like we said earlier, they might not be living their best fulfilled life because they've just accepted less to operate at.
Exactly. And so, what we know is that if that gene has got switched on, that 5-HTT-LPR gene, there's 3 variants of the sensitivity gene. What that does is it regulates serotonin. And serotonin influences our ability to rebound from emotional trauma and distress. And the thing that you were experiencing on the bike was that trauma. So it was quite traumatic for you to be going through chronic fatigue and all what it meant to your life. So what happens with that is that the accumulated stress is stored in a part of the brain that's really old. It's the reptilian brain, and it's a feeling thing. So what happens is that you've got a feeling memory that is then when you do something or another stress comes along, it's being triggered. And what we see also is, I mentioned earlier about us not being able to always process emotion very well. So I just thought it might be worth giving an example, see if anyone can relate to this. I lost my first baby. I was 24, and it was a normal pregnancy. Was a bit overdue. Went into hospital, all the medical contraptions and things, and they gave me oxytocin, much too much of it, and everything. Anyway, it transpired that the placenta all broke up during the delivery, and when my son was born, it was they resuscitated him while I was still in the room for 20 minutes, and there was like 20 people in the room. It had been forceps. It was the most traumatic thing. And sadly, I lost him the next day. It'd been a completely normal baby, but this had been so badly handled. And anyway, this is what happened. I literally discharged myself from the hospital. I couldn't cope with sitting with him at all. I knew I had to salvage part of me because I knew I couldn't cope. I was terrified of, actually being with him when he passed away, and I knew he was going to. All sorts of things happened. 3 weeks later, I was back at work. 3 weeks later, I went back to work. And what happened was that I worked in an environment where lots of people knew me, lots of people knew I was pregnant, and they were literally seeing me and running up to me and going, "Oh, you're back. What did you have?" And I had to then protect them from what I was about to tell them. So all that heightened sense of responsibility. I wasn't looking after me. I wasn't processing grief. I couldn't process the grief. So what I did was I went into my default, which was be busy, fill the time up with work. And so I think that this is often what we see with people that at some point tip over. There's been years and years of not being able to process emotion properly. I was always the person that stepped up and did everything. When my dad died, I organised, the funeral and did all these things and everything. And I can remember being in a disassociated state. Took me ages to be able to actually feel it.
Yes, and that's the key word there, isn't it? Is feeling, and we're human beings to feel, not human doings. And quite often, I just want to thank you first and foremost for sharing that story, because I'm sure there's people out there who've been through a similar experience, and gosh, it must have been horrifically painful. But rather than dealing with those feelings, we bury them. And I've been through different experiences that have been so painful that I just didn't want to deal with them. So you bury your head, don't you? And you move on, and you become a human doing rather than a human being.
That's where we disconnect.
We store it all up, don't we? And then it represents later in life, because it's got to come out somehow.
Exactly. And fibromyalgia, because we haven't talked a lot about fibromyalgia, but fibromyalgia, when we start to delve with people, it's always there is emotional trauma, unprocessed grief. There is usually relationship issues, painful. People, actually, the body will send you physical pain because it's easier to deal with than emotional pain. And that is the hard thing. It's often why people don't want to do that bit. They'll avoid the emotional health part of the wheel until they absolutely have to. But once you do, and you can process it and take the electrical charge out of that pain, then you can actually sit with what's happened to you in a completely different, from a place of peace and acceptance. And so it's challenging work, but it's has to be done somatically through the body, and it is just the most releasing and liberating thing. I think learning to recognize that you are sensitive and embrace it, and then we do the work of creating our life to eliminate the things that don't work for us, to make sure that we fill our lives with all the things that we need, that bring us joy, and also know that the work of processing emotion, being able to sit with that emotion and feel it, and having support of people who get it, other people that are highly sensitive. And I think that's a big part of, I call it role model medicine. We've got built a phenomenal community in our recovery pathway of recovery specialists, and also the people that are at different stages of their recovery. And knowing that someone else thinks like you do, and it's a safe space, and realize that you can be vibrant. You don't have to try and be like the dandelions. You can be an orchid, and honor your well-being above all else.
And putting yourself in the right environment, I guess, isn't it? Because
That's the hardest bit, because, you know, we find some people have to move home because they're so poorly. And of course, what they're doing is, for some people, it's like going back into the lion's den.
yes,
You know, family dynamics is absolutely crucial, dealing with the family dysfunction. And sadly, for some people, and that's for me, I had an ACE score of 7. So if you look at an ACE score of 7, the health outcomes for somebody with a high ACE score like that is potentially 20 years less lifespan.
wow,
That's how important this information is.
yeah.
But that doesn't have to be the case if you do what you need to do. So
And I guess even if people find themselves in an environment they wouldn't choose to be in, that's perhaps not the best environment for them, there are little things that they can do, aren't there? Like getting out into nature, just taking a breath of fresh air, just connecting back to some peace and quiet and tranquility, and taking that time. Are there any other tips or
all of those things. So I think really recognizing that being sensitive is a really good thing. It's 20% of the population. I think it's far more than that, actually, but it's a really good thing. And I really believe that you've been given that sensitivity for a reason. And you might be noticing things that are going on in those around you that aren't right. Trust your instincts. It's not right. And don't let someone convince you otherwise. I think that's the first thing. I think eliminate. So one of the things we suggest is certainly if you know that a family gathering, for instance, is going to have a delayed impact, because there's something called, there's a delayed stress reaction. So often you might have a health dip or a health crash and you can't figure it out. Think back, within the last 2 weeks, you've probably had a challenging conversation, or you've been to a wedding or a family gathering, or been together at Christmas and that. So I think recognizing who it's good to spend time with and who it isn't. And, we do garden. So eliminate those people from your life that are not good for you to be around, and limit the amount of time that you spend with them. Make sure you've got people in your life that uplift you. We talk a lot in the Chrysalis Effect about, you've got your birth family, and that they're all there to teach us something, and they've all got their own suffering, but you can create your soul family. And you create your soul family, the ones that get you. And I think that's what we've created in the Chrysalis Effect. We've got a soul family. There's complete respect, understanding, bit of fun along the way as well. So I think and tap in. Usually you've let go of doing things that lit you up as a child. Yes. So getting back into creative, anything that you love doing, singing, dancing, drawing. We've got an art, we've got a creative hub in the Chrysalis Effect, and seeing the incredible stuff people are doing. We've got a gardening hub, we've got yoga hub. So things that reconnect you to your body, and trust your satellite navigation. If something doesn't feel right, it's not right.
Yes. Yeah.
Don't second guess it.
And I second everything you say there. And one of the things I read the other day was, in your life you can promote, demote, or fire people. It's not just in work that you can do that. And
you can. And it's a challenge though, Lisa, because what are empaths? Empaths don't like upsetting people. Empaths already can predict how uncomfortable that person would feel, and that's the last thing that they want. But actually, when you really know yourself, and you know what's good for you and what isn't good for you, then when you honor that and you put your oxygen mask on you, because that's the other thing, is we tend to try and but that fixing everyone else and being there for everyone else is another avoidance tactic of feeling what you need to feel. So recognize that. And somebody said to me the other day, I know I need to practice more self-care, but I feel so selfish. So one of the things I would say that's super important is that something we do very early on is we look at your values. So you need to look at the values, so things that are important to you, because it's our values that generate what we believe about things, and it's our beliefs that create our thoughts, and it's our thoughts that then impact how we feel about doing things or not doing things.
Yeah.
If we know what our values are, what often has happened for us empaths is we've grown up in a set of values that didn't feel right, but we've tried to honour them, and we feel guilty when we don't do what other people expect of us.
Yeah.
So if you're feeling in conflict, or you're telling yourself that you should do this, or you feel, or you know, it's hard to say no, you ought to, if you're shoulding, oughting and musting on yourself, then the chances are you're trying to honour values that aren't yours. So have a spring clean of your values. Get the ones that
feel like effort, should it? You know, if you're saying I should, I could, or I would have done this differently, then you're not aligned to your values, are you?
Yeah, these are your decision makers. So when you get your value, when you've spring cleaned them and got rid of the ones that you're telling yourself you should have. So a good example of that is if you've been brought up in a family with like duty is really important, and putting others first is really important. All of those things, you might have learned that. So that's what you feel and believe is the right thing to do. And when you feel that actually you don't want to do that, and you want to go and spend time being creative, which potentially someone's told you is a waste of time and daydreaming or whatever.
Yes.
When you do what actually is what you want to do, yes, then you will be at peace. So you can test out when you're honouring your actual values, you'll feel peace and happiness. When you are trying to honour someone else's, you're going to feel conflicted. You're going to feel the thing is, if I don't do this, I'll feel guilty. That's not the space to be living in.
Yeah. So if people are feeling that, then they know they're working for
then they know that that's not your values. Yes. And so there's a bit of work to do there. And one of the things we do a lot of work on is building up those assertion skills and boundaries and all of that. So that all comes as part of recovery. And so, you know, that's why we call it the chrysalis effect. When life isn't working for you and you're that voracious caterpillar going round like crazy, and then suddenly you're stopped, your body's saying no, and we fight that, we resist it massively. But what happens inside that chrysalis is that caterpillar dissolves into a soup, and that's terrifying. You know, I remember when I had to give up my business, when I wasn't able to work, when I wasn't able to do, I didn't know who the hell I was. It was terrifying. But my body had physically stopped me to give me the space to revisit all of that. And I came out of that dark place where I was terrified. I came out of there the person I was supposed to be. And with the life that I was, yeah.
And for anyone out there who's feeling hopeless, then, you know, what a great inspirational story to know that you can come out of that. You can be in a dark place and come out of it. And one of the things that, you know, Gandhi says, be the change. Exactly, we have to be the change, don't we? We have to realign our values, and then we will come out as the butterfly. And life will just happen around us, and relationships will change around us. We don't need to, you know, when we talked earlier about promoting and demoting people, you don't have to physically do that. It just happens naturally when you're aligned to your values. You might go for months without talking to someone, but you attract new people into your life. You're on your wavelength. And it's about letting, exactly, I love your analogy about letting that evolve naturally. And just letting it happen when you reconnect with your true values.
Yeah, exactly. And that is the thing, I think, is that we attract the people that are going to teach us the lesson. So we attract the perhaps the negative people, the people that put upon us, you know, all of those things. They're just all the teachers in life, aren't they? When you stop reacting and responding to that in your people pleasing way, or your need to fix or negating what you need, when you really completely standing in your own power and you know what's right, you just give off a completely different energy. So of course the people that come to you are all the people that are going to support you to become everything you're supposed to be. And so I think a lot of people are frightened of being alone, so they put up with bad relationships because they think that it's worse being alone than, you know, being with. But there's worse things than being alone, and that's being in destructive relationships. It really is. So actually, it's the opposite is the case. Is that, as you've just said, Lisa, you will just have, you know, you're going to attract your soul family when you do the brave thing. And the brave thing is honor that your body is really trying to get you somewhere amazing.
It's communicating with you, isn't it? It's like you said earlier, it's your satellite navigation, and use it to support you on your journey.
Yeah, it'll never put you wrong, never put you wrong. So when I'm asked to do something, as I often am, you know, I just go in and think, oh, okay, how does that feel? And if it's like that and it lifts me and I get that little spark, oh, you know, if it's and I'm finding myself avoiding it, then do you know what? Probably if I check back to my values, it's not in alignment, and it's just me having those memories of that people pleasing behavior in there. You know, that would be an old little memory of that old default behavior. So and well, the minute you say no and you stick with what's right, amazing things happen.
Yeah. And it's trusting that, isn't it? That feeling. And I love what you said there. You said, you know, I always ask myself, well, how does this feel? And for our listeners out there who can't see Elaine, what she just demonstrated then is if she's feeling uplifted, her body language just changed, and she sat up in her chair. And she said, if it doesn't feel right, it's almost like a bit of a slump back down in the chair, isn't it? And it's noticing that feeling and how that has a very subtle impact on our body language as well, isn't it? And do what feels right for you rather than what feels logical, because sometimes we work from our logical brain rather than from our feeling. And we work from our feeling and we don't even know how, and we're trying to figure it all out. Just trust it.
Yeah, you don't need to, because actually you're guided. That's the amazing thing. When you stop trying to control it all and do it all and fix it all yourself, and you trust and you allow this intelligence that we have. And if you think of children before they've had it conditioned out of them, you know, what did you want to do when you were 7? What you never used to say to yourself, I'd like to do that, but I can't do that because my body isn't the right shape, or I don't think I'd be very good at that. You know, that the adults do that for us, don't they? The adults in our life tell us what they think we can and can't. One of the biggest problems, if you ask any lecturer or teacher or whatever, and I taught for a while, and I saw this, was how many people go on a path because someone else thought it was a good idea, or they wanted to, you know, please that person. If you think about some of the high-flying careers where that happens at its most, it's medicine and law, where it tends to run in families. So, you know, we see a lot of high flyers that get there and are completely and utterly empty when they've achieved it, because it was never right.
Yeah, because they're not following their soul purpose, are they? So then they're not surrounded by their soul family.
No, exactly. And then what happens? There's lots of blame, shame, and guilt, which it comes up in all of us sensitive children, because we think everything is our fault, you know. So that goes back. But just on that note, just to sort of finish off on the ACE thing, is that there is this problem with children being able to regulate, and that goes on into adulthood. So the self-regulation, the way we often choose to try and self-regulate and feel better is where we're self-medicating. And that would be drinking, comfort eating, shopping, retail therapy, getting into relationships that are awful, because actually the drama of that relationship again keeps us so busy and occupied, doesn't it? So we self-medicate instead of feeling. So I think the journey to recovery is that you do learn what you need to self-regulate. And when you do that, of course, you can have an impact on those genetics.
Yes.
So that's why you can go forward, and you haven't got this sentence that you're going to be ill forever. That's not true.
And that's that whole subject of epigenetics, which is a whole nother podcast in itself.
Absolutely.
And how our lifestyle can affect our
yeah.
Oh, it's so wonderful, Elaine, and what a wealth of knowledge we've shared with our listeners today, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Is there a parting kind of message or tip you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Well, my mantra is to honour my well-being above all else, and that is something that permeates everything we do in the Chrysalis Effect. Really, that's the simple. That is where we're aiming to support people to get to a position where they do that, because when you do that, everything falls into place. So I think if you even have that as a starting point, where am I honouring my well-being, and where am I dishonouring my well-being and my needs? I think the most important thing, and certainly if you're listening to this and you're struggling with all those symptoms and things, one of the first steps is look at life beyond this current. These symptoms are temporary. They absolutely are. Don't believe anyone else that tells you otherwise. Recovery is absolutely possible, and so know that in your heart, and look at what would be the perfect life for you beyond what you're going through right now, because without vision the people perish. It's in the Proverbs. So I think looking at life beyond the illness, realizing that they're only symptoms, and that is just the messages coming from your body, and then work through to find what you need to do to honour your well-being above all else. And if you have got some of that history of difficulties and trauma that you've pushed down and haven't dealt with, then I would say that honouring what we eat, our nutrition, making sure our environment serves us, getting a lifestyle and pace that we love and that we're not feeling crushed under, making sure our relationships are healthy, and getting an absolute handle on what being open to the fact that what you're doing now is possibly not your life purpose. And I think get curious about that, and know that you can come out of this having such a wealth of love in your life, really, and that's what it's all about at the end of the day, isn't it? Self-love.
How wonderful. Self-love, and putting your wellness above everything else. It's important, isn't it? Because if we're not healthy and happy, then life can't happen, can it?
We can't give to others what we don't have.
No. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Elaine. If people want to get in contact with you, because you do some amazing work and you support people from all walks of life, how do they get in contact with you?
Certainly. So the website is thechrysaliseffect.co.uk.
Okay. So I'll put that in the show notes so people can get access to that. But it's .co.uk because we're in the UK. Yeah. So thechrysaliseffect.co.uk.
Yeah, but we work internationally, so it's not a problem. It's just that's the website, and that on there you can go through and you can come through and come immediately, because it's all about instant access and agile personalized support. So we've got a recovery pathway in there that you can come on to, and you can try that for 30 days to see if that's a good fit for you. If you're a therapist and you are working with clients through the sorts of things we've talked about, all those symptoms will be presenting in your practice, then there's a contact us page on there where if you'd like some more information about some specialist training in recovery work or trauma-informed practice, any of the things we've talked about, then do get in touch, and we can make sure that you've got the right information for what you may be looking for.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. So it's going to help individuals who are either going through this or individuals who want to help others. So you've got
We work as a
support for everybody
huge team.
and
But
become part of the Soul family.
yeah, come and join our Soul family. We were all doing yoga together yesterday. It was lovely. So thank you, Lisa, because one of the most difficult things for the work that we do is awareness. Is expensive, and we wanted to make sure that we could provide recovery support regardless of people's financial situation. That was really important. So we've got a non-profit arm of our business, and you'll know, as a business owner, getting the message out there is the most expensive and difficult thing that we can do. So I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, giving me the opportunity to be able to get this information out there.
You're very welcome, and it's a pleasure to talk to you as always. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Lisa Victoria, and this is Alternative Health Tools. We hope you've enjoyed the show today. You can find this podcast on anywhere you get your podcasts from: Apple, Google, and Spotify. And we look forward to speaking to you on the next podcast.